Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is our YouTube series on how to help you play chess better. If you don't know who I am, I'm a national master for the U.S. Chess Federation. I've written 12 chess books, including books like The Improving Chess Thinker, Everyone's Second Chess Book, Back to Basics Tactics, The World's Most Instructive Amateur Game Book. I think all these books are pretty instructive. And that's kind of my goal. I've been a full-time chess instructor since 1996. And I just started making some new videos here on YouTube to show you the kind of things that I've been teaching my students on how to help them play better. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the 6 things you want to do when you're way ahead in a chess game. When the computer says you're winning easily, you're ahead in material. We're not talking about positions where you have a slight positional advantage, or maybe you have a pawn but your opponent's got some play. We're talking about positions where you're really winning easily. In these positions, you really don't want to play the same way you play when the game's even. For instance, when the game's even, going out of your way to win a pawn might be the difference between drawing the game and winning the game. But if you're up a queen, wasting your time going around trying to win a pawn may be a good way to end up losing the game. So things are a lot different, and that's true in every sport. Let's take basketball. You know, if you're in a game in the 4th quarter and it's tied 73-73 and you're running a key play and you're trying to maybe get the major person on the other side in foul trouble, maybe they have a star center and he's got 4 fouls and you want him to pick up a 5th foul, you're going to run a certain play to your center to try to draw the foul. These are all really important strategies. You're going to run a pick and roll. You're going to do whatever to try to get those extra points to put you ahead and to stop the other team from scoring so that you can win the basketball game. Okay, but suppose your basketball team is up 200-3 in the 4th quarter because it's a bunch of NBA players playing a bunch of kindergarten kids. Then what are you going to do? Well, it's a little bit different then. In fact, you would win even if all your guys lied down on the court. But one of the first things you would do would be to take all your best players off the court, because if, Michael Jordan or Steph Curry or LeBron James or somebody like that broke a leg when your team was up 200-3, you probably should get your coach fired. So the strategy when you're way ahead in a game and you're way behind is a lot different. And chess is a little bit different than basketball. In basketball, if you're up 200-3 with 3 minutes to go, you're going to win the game no matter what happens. In chess, there's almost no position where you're going to win no matter what happens. Even if you have a king and a queen against a king, if you're not careful, you could stalemate him. So I call those ideas that you could all of a sudden throw away the game a flubly. So one of the articles I've written is called "Don't Allow the Flubly." So, for instance, if I'm up a king and a queen against a king, I know I'm going to checkmate the other guy. So my main goal is to not stalemate him, not rather than checkmate him. I know I'm going to checkmate him if I don't stalemate him. So the way you play the game when you're way ahead is a lot different. So I've come up with 6 things that I think are the most important. The number one thing that's the most important is don't allow your opponent to get back in the game. And the way to not do that, to stop him from doing that, is to look at the board and say, if I were him, what would I do to get back in the game? Could I trap my queen or checkmate me with a surprise checkmate or something like that? Look for ways that he's not resigning. If your opponent's way behind and he's not resigning, say, I could get back rank mated if I'm not careful, or something like that. And make sure those things can never happen. Another way to look at this is, suppose you have 1,000,000 ways to win and 3 ways to lose. What should you do? Well, the first thing you should do is make sure those 3 ways can't happen, and then you could go play one of those 1,000,000 ways to win. I call this idea think defense first, and I've been misquoted on this 1,000,000 times. People say, Dan Heisman says you should play defensively when you're winning. Well, I never said that, and I don't even believe that, because think defense first and play defensively both use the same root word defense, but they don't mean the same thing. When I say think defense first, what I mean is, if you have 100 things that you'd like to do, make sure those 3 ways he can beat you don't exist, and then go play an offensive move. That's fine. That's not playing defensively. You're playing offensively. You're just using that checklist first to make sure those defensive ideas are covered. Okay, that doesn't mean I'm playing them. It doesn't mean I have to play moves to play that way. It just means I have to think defense first. And what you play and what you think are related, but they're not the same thing. So this is think defense first. Make sure that however your opponent can get back in the game does not happen. Okay, number 2 is the famous keep it simple principle. When you're playing a game and you're way ahead, complications tremendously favor the person that's losing. Good players have a word for this. They call it fire on board, meaning create tremendous complications. When you're losing, you want things complicated because you have nothing to lose. If you're losing and it gets complicated and you mess it up, it's okay. You were lost anyway. But if you're winning and it gets complicated and you mess it up and you end up losing stuff and you end up drawing or losing the game because you complicated it, there was no reason to do that. When you're way ahead, it's rarely necessary to complicate the game. In fact, it's probably almost never necessary to have to complicate the game if it's not already. Your opponent might try to do that, but you don't have to. So it's keep it simple, KISS principle. Number 3 is the very famous thing, which is trade pieces but not necessarily pawns. And I actually like to say make fair trades of pieces, not necessarily pawns. Although if you're so far ahead that you could make an unfair trade, but it still helps you when the smoke clears. For instance, suppose you have a queen and 3 pawns against a rook. Let's create well, I don't want to mess up this position because I've got a game here I want to show you. But if you have a queen and 3 pawns against a rook, you might be able to take off his rook with your queen and then just win with the king and 3 pawns against his king. That might be easier than trying to, push the pawns down the board against the rook. So there you made an uneven trade, but what was left on the board was an easy win. The 4th thing I like to do when I'm way ahead is use all my pieces like I'm an ice hockey team on a power play. If an ice hockey team's on a power play, what do? Well, they make sure every one of their guys is active and pressing so that they have more guys in the play than the other team does. In chess, you see a lot of beginners, they win something and then they take 2 or 3 pieces and they go around trying to win something more. That doesn't make any sense. Make sure every single piece is in the game. Number 5 is don't worry about little things. If you're up a knight and you could trade queens but it doubles your pawns, well, that might be slightly annoying if you're completely even, just like if your basketball team's 73-73 and you commit a turnover, that won't necessarily lose you the game, but it could affect your chances of winning. In chess, if you're up a knight and you could trade queens and it doubles your pawns, who cares? Just trade queens. Just like if you're up 200-3 in a basketball game, you're not as worried about the turnover anymore. So don't worry about the little things when you're way ahead. Number 6 is don't get into unnecessary time pressure because you don't have to play the exact best moves anymore. You don't have to even look for them. Every reasonably strong move will win the game. So if you are playing a 1-hour game and with 37 minutes left you end up a knight, you shouldn't have to run your clock down to 2 or 3 seconds left to win the game. That doesn't mean you should play fast and end up with 36 minutes left. But if you end the game with 3 or 4 minutes left instead of 1 or 2 minutes left, just to make sure you don't get into unnecessary time trouble, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to get into severe time trouble when you're way ahead because then you could make some really rash decisions and throw the game away. Let me review the 6 and then we're going to look at a game that a student played where he didn't really follow this and we'll explain how he lost. Okay, so the 6 again are number 1, think defense first, which does not mean play defensively. Number 2, keep it simple. Number 3, make fair trades of pieces, not necessarily pawns. Number 4, make sure to use all your pieces all the time. Number 5, don't worry about the little things. And number 6, don't get into unnecessary time pressure. All right, so let's look at a game. This is a game a student played within the last year. He was white. He opened up e4. His opponent played e5. He played f4, King's Gambit. His opponent took. He played knight f3, and his opponent played bishop e7. Is that the Kieseritzky? I'm not a specialty on all the King's Gambit game names, but I haven't played either side of the King's Gambit for a while. But I think it might be the Kieseritzky defense. All right, so white plays bishop c4 and black checks. And now I think the major line here is to play like king to f1. But instead, what white plays is g3. This is a line he prepared in advance. It's sort of like what someone once called the Texas tumbleweed in a similar position. So f takes, castles, g takes h2, king h1, creating a barrier with that black 2 pawn on h2 to protect the king, and now white has all those open lines. All right, so he says the next few moves are booked. Black plays d5, giving back one of those pawns to open up his line for his bishop and to try to hit at the center. White says thanks for the pawn. Bishop takes d5. And black plays knight f6. All right, so why can't white just win the bishop? Because black has just removed his own guard from the bishop on h4. So why can't white play knight h4? Well, the answer is if white plays knight h4, black will play knight takes d5 and get a discovered attack on the knight. And if white saves the knight, then black will save his knight and win the bishop. And if black takes the knight, e takes d4, then black can play queen to h4, takes h4, and get his piece back. So that's why knight takes h4 doesn't just win. So here my student prepared a line, which the computer I don't think thinks is the best move. Let me turn on the computer for a second. Mr. Computer, what's the top 2 moves here? Computer says black is better no matter what white does, and it thinks that line we just looked at with knight takes h4 might be white's best, but that wasn't the recommended line. And white played what was recommended in the book that he was reading. He played bishop takes f7 check, with the idea that now when he takes the bishop, there's no knight to take, and he can stop the black king from castling. So black plays king takes f7, and of course white gets his piece back with knight takes h4, and now black should get his rook in the game. Notice white is not threatening e5, hitting the pin knight. Why isn't that a threat? Well, the answer is if black does nothing here, let's say a6, and white plays e5, hopefully you can visualize, look ahead, and see that black could play queen to d5 check, double attacking the e-pawn and the king. So e5 is not really a threat, but black still wants to get his rook into the game and then tuck his king back away. So the computer's top 2 moves here are rook to f8, since e5 is not a threat, getting the rook on the open file, neutralizing that pressure, and getting his king back later, or playing knight c6 and developing his pieces. Those are the top 2 moves. Instead, black blunders. Well, we did say that we're talking about what to do when you're winning easily, and in order for us to be winning easily, our opponent has to do something really bad so that we can get ahead, and this is going to be the main move where black really blunders. He plays the superficially aggressive move, bishop to g4. This is an over-the-board tournament game, so you would think he would realize that this is not a very good move. And now white plays what Charles Hertan calls taking advantage of a sneaky pin. A sneaky pin is where you attack squares that a pin piece is not really guarding. And here, this knight on f6 is not really guarding this bishop because that knight is not allowed to move because the rook's pinning it to the king. So, of course, white just plays queen takes g4. Thanks for the sneaky pin. All right, well, now we've achieved our goal. White is ahead a piece, and now he needs to start applying those 6. What are those 6 again? Think defense first. Keep it simple. Trade pieces, not necessarily pawns. Use all your pieces all the time. Don't worry about the little things, and avoid unnecessary time pressure. Okay, so black plays knight bd7. Well, it's actually knight d7 since the other knight can't go there. And now white should just develop his pieces, play something like d3 or knight c3. White plays d3. And now black should continue to develop his pieces, but he's desperate. He's losing. So he attacks the queen with knight e5, but that's not really a good move because now white can double attack that knight and the king and force black into some awkward situations. So white plays queen h5 check. Now this is a little bit complicated, but he is gaining even more. So I can't criticize him too much for playing something a little bit tricky here. And now he's attacking the knight, and he's attacking. So for instance, if the knight goes back to g6 now, white can start piling up on this knight. He could play like, bishop to g5. All of black's pieces are tied up. Black instead plays king to e6, but that runs into queen to f5 check. King to d6. Black's got to keep guarding the knight, or else white will take the knight. And now white has many ways of putting the pressure on that knight. The way he chooses is as good as any. He just pins the knight. bishop there. He's got d4 coming up soon if he needs it. He doesn't really need it. Black tries to guard it with knight to d7. White continues to put the pressure on the knight. Now black could continue to try to guard the knight with queen e7 or queen f6 or rook e8. Instead, black counterattacks the queen, but now white has a Zwischenzug, an in-between move, where he can take the knight first with check, and he's ending up winning the knight anyway. So he plays bishop takes check. Okay, and now black has lost the second piece. He plays king e7. What would be a good idea for white here? And the answer is trade queens. You know, you're up 2 pieces. The endgame should be trivial. So trade queens. So white plays queen to g5 check, a good move. Black's kind of between a rock and a hard place here because white's also threatening the pawn on g7. So black plays back king to e8. And now white has a choice. He can play queen takes g7 or queen takes d8 check. Well, if you give this to a computer, the computer's going to say, wow, they're about equally as good. But if you're a human and you're trying to win a game, you want to just make it simple. You know, if you trade things off, it increases the percentage of your advantage. For instance, if you're up the equivalent of 20 pawns to 15 and you trade off 9, then you're up 11 pawns to 6. And 11 to 6 is a lot better ratio than 20 to 15. So here white, I think correctly, trades queens. Queen takes d8. Black decides to take with the king, and now black is threatening knight takes e5, which is his own sneaky pin, because the knight's pinned to the rook. So the best way to stop that would be just to move this knight on b1 to guard the other rook, so knight takes e5 is not a threat. White gets a little greedy here, and he saves the bishop by taking the pawn. Well, saving the bishop is a good idea, and moving the bishop is probably okay. And taking a pawn's okay. It's just that he doesn't want to continue doing this. He doesn't need pawns to win the game. Right now, he's up a bishop and a knight, and, well, the black has doubled isolated pawns, and that pawn on h2 is pretty much a goner anyway. White's up plenty. He doesn't need to win any pawns. The only thing that makes bishop takes g7 a really good move is the fact that black was threatening knight takes e5 anyway, so if you have to move the bishop, why not take a pawn? All right, so black plays rook to g8, and now white should just stick this bishop on some really safe square, which he does. He plays bishop to c3. Okay, there's no way white should lose here. All he needs to do is get the knight, get into the game, get the rook in the game. Then he can start moving his pawns up and move his pieces up, trade off all the pieces. Game over. Black plays c5. And now white can play knight d2. He can play knight a3. I've had a lot of students in these kind of positions say, I don't want to play knight a3. Knight on the rim, my future's dim. Well, again, if the game is close, and where your knight is makes a little bit of difference. That could be a big difference in the game if the game is close. If you're up 2 pieces like you are here, the fact that the knight is on the rim and takes an extra tempo to come into the game means almost absolutely nothing. So again, it's sort of like if it's 73-73 in the basketball game and you have a turnover, that could really affect the game. But if it's 200-3 and you have a turnover, it's not going to make much difference. So here, the principal knight on the rim, your future's dim, has almost no value. All you want to do is get your pieces in the game. If it takes an extra tempo to get your knight toward the middle, later with knight to c4, knight to b5 or something, no big deal. All right, so white plays knight to d2, moves it toward the center. Good move. And black really doesn't have that much to do here. Even if white takes both rooks off the back rank and black plays rook g1 check, white can always play king h2. This is an example of that think defense first. You'd look at the board and you'd say, how could white lose? So you ask yourself, could I lose if I took both my rooks off the back rank? And the answer is not very easily. The only way you could lose if you took both rooks off the back rank is if somehow black could guard this pawn on h2 with one of his pieces and then check with the rook on the back rank. And that's very, very difficult to do in this position. Now you might say, why not just take the pawn? And the answer is, well, you could, but that pawn is actually still a good shield, and it can't be saved. So white's in no rush to win the pawn, and he's doing the right thing here by holding off on doing that while he develops his pieces. It's not that taking the pawn is a terrible mistake. It's just that it's completely not necessary. All right, so black plays king to c7, getting his king out of the way so he can get his rook in the game. And now white should just play something like rook on A to E1, and then he could push the E pawn down the board. He could do lots of things. If he wants to double his rooks, he could play rook F2, double his rooks. Then later he can move the knight over, try to trade knights, get his rook down. Easy win. He should get this rook into the game. That rook represents a large amount of the difference. If you look at how much he's ahead of bishop and a knight. Well, a bishop and a knight is worth more than a rook, but it's not a ton more than a rook. It's enough to win the game, a bishop and a knight versus a rook. But if you play the rest of the game without that rook on A1, it would be almost very, very difficult to win. All right, so white plays knight E5. Well, I can't completely criticize that move. It opens up the F file. It offers to trade, which is what he should be doing. But he really wants to get that rook in the game. All right, now black really doesn't want to trade here, so he probably should move the knight. But instead, he plays rook A D8. And now if white wants, he can just trade off the knights, and black's down to just 2 rooks. But white plays a move that's actually maybe even a little better because it trades off 2 pieces instead of 1. He plays rook F7. So I looked at this position and I said, okay, student, just take, no matter what he plays on the next move, take on D7, trade everything off. He's left with just a rook. You have a rook, a bishop, and a knight. This game is, then he can't guard the pawn on H2 with a piece, much less the fact that you can just take it. And this game is over. At this point, there's not much to look for. The problem is my student was sitting here thinking, why doesn't he resign? Instead of thinking, you know, why isn't he resigning and how can I get back in the game? White's thinking, all right, I'm going to punish this guy by checkmating him. Instead of saying, all right, why is he not resigning? How do I trade everything off? So here black plays king to C8, getting out of the pin, which means he's threatening to move the knight and not trade anything off. So the right move here for white, well, what would you play for white? We'll ask the viewer what they would play. If your answer was knight takes D7, well, that's a very good move. And if he wants to get his piece back, he'd have to take with the rook, and then you take with the rook. But my answer is you should play rook takes D7. It's usually more forcing to take with the rook in this kind of position because I'm not only getting the knight, but I'm also saying to him, if you don't trade, you're going to have to waste tempos with your rook as well. So you're going to have to trade. So rook takes D7 is just slightly more forcing than knight takes D7 if you want to trade off all the pieces. So that's the move I would play. And I wouldn't take much time on this move. I would just play rook takes D7, boom. And he would play rook takes D7. I would play knight takes D7. He'd play king takes D7. And then I'd get my rook in the game. And if I want to take the pawn on H2, fine. And this game is toast. Any move other than knight takes D7 or rook takes D7, I wouldn't even look at. But for some reason, my student plays king takes H2. Well, he could have done that at any point, but this was his big chance to trade off all these pieces. He could have gotten rid of the rook and the knight, and he would have been left with a rook, a bishop, and a knight against a rook instead of having 2 rooks, 2 knights, and a bishop against 2 rooks and a knight. Well, 2 rooks and a knight are a lot easier to cause problems than just 1 rook. So king takes H2, completely the wrong idea. Now the computer's going to tell you, oh, it's perfectly good. I'm still winning just as easily. But if you're a human and you're trying to make it easy, just trade those pieces off. When he played that move, I let out a little yell and I said, what are you doing? Just play rook D7. So black takes the knight. He only trades 1 piece instead of 2, which of course he doesn't want to trade it off. He doesn't have to. And white takes with the bishop. And now white's thinking, oh man, I'm going to threaten rook C7 and get a, discovered attack and everything. That's not the way white should be thinking. White's already up 2 pieces. All he has to do is trade everything off. He should be thinking, oh, I should just play rook G1 and trade rooks. He's trying to checkmate black instead of just trying to trade everything off and win. Well, yes, if you're a very strong player rated over 2,000 and you calculate this all correctly and you want to do it that way and play the cleverest way to win, that's fine. But if you want to just win the game, you don't need to do that. You're already up. If your basketball team's up 200-3, you don't have to figure out how many 3-pointers you can make. You just can run out the clock. So here black plays rook on D to E8 to hit the bishop. Well, there's 5 ways to make a piece safe, but the easiest one is almost always just move it. If you can't take off the attacking piece. So here I would play something like bishop G3 to shield my king, or maybe bishop F6 to just block this rook from coming up and attacking my king. Or maybe bishop g7 to block this line for this rook. Or maybe just bishop c3 to put it on a nice safe square. That's what I'm going to do. Instead, White's thinking offense, offense, offense. Well, I always said think defense first. I didn't say play defensively. There's nothing wrong with playing offense here, but right now, the first thing you should do is just save the bishop. Well, White does, but he saves it in a silly way. He plays knight to c4. The problem with knight to c4 is after Black stops this fork, Black's going to be threatening b5, removing the guard, winning the bishop. Well, why would you want to allow him to set up a tactic like that? Just to get in a cheap trick of threatening to fork him. So there's no reason to do that. It's not that knight c4 is a bad move. The computer's going to tell you if you play perfectly on every move after this that knight c4 is perfectly good. But why set yourself up for a possible tactic where you could lose the bishop if he sees your fork? There's no reason to do that. So as I said, the easiest thing to do is just move the bishop. Even a move like d4 is better because there's no possible tactic for Black here. The knight's guarding the pawn. If he takes and you take and he comes back and skewers you, you can just guard the bishop. There's just nothing that Black can do if you just save the bishop. So White plays knight to c4. It's not a bad move. It's just that he's representing a very bad kind of mental philosophy here in this position. And I talked to my student after the game. I mean, he said he's thinking offense, checkmate. You know, he's trying to get the knight in the game. He's trying to fork him. That's what he's trying to do. All right, so Black says, I'm not going to let you fork me. And he plays rook to e6. And White says, all right, I know why he did that. He did that to stop my knight check. The problem is, as I've taught on many, many, many occasions, you're not supposed to ask, why did my opponent make that move? It's a terrible thing to ask. What you're supposed to ask is two things. One is that move safe? And two, what are all the things that move does? Well, that move actually does three things, not one. It stops the knight fork. That's one. Two, it sets up the tactic b5, removing the knight from guarding the bishop and winning the knight. And three, it sets up mate in one. But as you might suspect, my student was thinking offense, 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 offense. And when Black played rook e6, he said, oh, darn, he saw my knight fork. Darn, I guess I'm going to have to beat him a different way. So he didn't pay any attention to the other threats that Black made because he says, I know why he made rook e6. He made rook e6 to stop that knight fork. And that's all he thought. And that's what he told me after the game is, oh, he played rook e6 to stop my knight fork. That's what I was thinking. So now he checks, which is not a good move because White should be saying to himself, oh my goodness, he's threatening b5, he's threatening rook h6. What are all the moves that stop both those moves and try to, stop me from losing a piece? For instance, maybe he could play bishop g3. Now if Black plays b5, there's no bishop to win. And if he plays rook checks, you can play here, and if he pins the bishop, you can guard it, and if he pushes the pawn to try to hit the bishop, you can move your king out of the way, and you're perfectly safe. That's the kind of things he should be thinking about. But instead, all he's thinking is, oh, he stopped my fork, I'll get him anyway. So he checks. And he says, haha, if you go into a discovered attack, I can move my rook and attack one of your rooks and win it. And if you move the other way, you've got two hanging pawns. So Black, of course, moves king to d8. And now White's going to probably end up losing the bishop because b5 is going to be a threat, but he's still winning. All he has to do is stop the mate with rook takes on h7. If he plays rook takes h7 and he plays carefully, he should win. But he has no idea that Black's threatening to mate him. He just thinks that Black is playing this terrible defense and Black's not resigning, and Black should be resigning, and he's being insulted because Black's not resigning. So he plays rook takes b7. And you guessed it, Black says, oh, thank you for removing that shield of that pawn on h2. I'll play rook h6 with a side rank mate. And my student was absolutely shocked. He had no idea that this was coming. And he's like, oh, I lost this game. Well, but how many of those 6 things did he really do well? And the answer is not that many. If he had followed them and he had asked himself the right questions, like what are all the things that move does, rather than why did he make that move, well, this would have been quite a different game. And he said he learned his lesson and he will never do this again. So we'll see. Hopefully the people watching the video won't do it either. All right, for my YouTube series, hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe you'll subscribe or tell other people. I appreciate it. For my YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. See you next time. Bye.